260,000 federal workers are currently going without pay. A massive alleged data breach is under active investigation across multiple agencies. And the Senate's primary focus this week? Turning an uncontroversial veterans bill into a proxy war over the 2026 elections.
Just standard operating procedure for the upper chamber.
Welcome to Floor Notes. I'm Paige.
And I'm Reed.
When you look at the legislative calendar, a routine veterans bill shouldn't have anything to do with an agency shutdown or election mechanics. The VA is already funded, but the Senate operates on the vehicle system. When leadership needs something to move fast, they strip the text out of an unrelated bill that has already cleared committee hurdles and drop in the exact language they want to pass.
Which brings us to the proxy war. Since we have a little more room to breathe today, we're going to trace exactly how an amendment from Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah got attached to the funding debate. It rewired the floor dynamics overnight.
That amendment incorporates the SAVE Act, which requires proof of citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. Once that language was introduced, a baseline negotiation over agency funding instantly shifted into a standoff over election administration.
We'll also track the fallout from that data breach. The Homeland Security Committee is quietly pulling administration officials into closed-door briefings while the rest of the chamber fights over the voting schedule. You have members walking out of classified cybersecurity meetings straight into hallway press conferences about campaign politics.
The split screen is stark.
It really is. But the lapsed appropriations are the immediate pressure point.
Let's get into the DHS shutdown and the SAVE Act standoff.
We are 35 days into a partial government shutdown.
Specifically, the Department of Homeland Security. This affects roughly 260,000 federal employees across the agency.
The immediate visible impact is at the airports. TSA agents are operating under essential worker protocols. They are required to report for their shifts and manage security lines without receiving a paycheck.
Republican Senator Bernie Moreno of Ohio put the human cost front and center during his floor time. He listed the practical realities for those families: making rent, handling car payments, buying groceries for a weekend barbecue. I will read from the record. I find it deeply ironic, and quite frankly, I will use the word disgusting, that we here in the U.S. Senate are getting paid, while 260,000 people aren't getting paid because of political shenanigans from the other side.
The shenanigans he is referencing is a fundamental standoff over what gets included in the appropriations bill. The two parties are deadlocked over funding for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, and a piece of election legislation called the SAVE Act.
Let's pull those apart, starting with ICE. The Democrats have repeatedly offered to pass immediate, clean funding for the Transportation Security Administration, the Coast Guard, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and FEMA.
They want to carve out those undisputed agencies and leave ICE on the negotiating table.
Correct. Democratic Senator Patty Murray of Washington State went to the floor to detail exactly what her caucus is demanding in exchange for ICE funding. They want specific operational changes codified into legislative text. She listed requiring judicial warrants for arrests, mandatory body cameras, and visible identification for agents in the field.
Murray argued that Congress already allocated billions to the border in previous funding cycles. She explicitly refused to approve further appropriations without those accountability measures, citing instances of mistaken identity and civil rights violations during recent enforcement actions.
The irony of the shutdown, as Senator Murray pointed out, is that ICE agents are actually still receiving their paychecks. The agency has alternative funding streams from previous appropriations packages. The financial pressure is falling entirely on the agencies that both sides agree are functioning properly.
Which is exactly why Republicans are refusing to break the department apart. Republican Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming argued that the Department of Homeland Security was designed after September 11th as an integrated unit.
His point is that you cannot decouple airport security from interior immigration enforcement or cyber defense. Barrasso noted a recent cyber attack by Iran on a medical device company in Michigan. which forced hospitals to pause transmitting vital sign data. He argued that the whole system needs to be online, and he accused Democrats of trying to piecemeal national security.
Which led to a highly unusual floor speech from Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. He stood up and essentially advised his own party to take the Democrats' deal.
He did. He suggested fully funding TSA and FEMA today to get the airport lines moving.
But his solution for ICE is what makes the strategy so fascinating. Kennedy proposed using the budget reconciliation process to fund ICE and pass the SAVE Act with only 51 votes, bypassing the need for any Democratic support.
Reconciliation is the budgetary maneuver that allows the Senate to sidestep the 60-vote filibuster rule, but it comes with strict limitations, known as the Byrd Rule. Every provision in a reconciliation bill must have a direct impact on the federal budget.
Kennedy acknowledged that reality. He admitted that many in his own conference are skeptical that the SAVE Act, which alters voter registration rules, could survive a review by the Senate parliamentarian. His exact advice was to go get a really smart lawyer and ask him to help us craft a SAVE Act that can survive a Byrd bath.
He knows he is somewhat isolated on this approach.
He joked about it. He told the chamber, sometimes the majority just means all the fools are on the same side.
Since the reconciliation route is currently sidelined, Republican leadership is trying a different procedural path. And this involves a bill known as S. 1383.
If you look at the original text of S. 1383, introduced back in April 2025 by Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida and Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, it creates the Veterans Advisory Committee on Equal Access.
A completely non-controversial initiative.
Exactly. The House passed it and sent it back to the Senate. But instead of voting on the Veterans Committee, Republican Senator John Thune of South Dakota stepped in with a motion to concur on the House amendment using a substitute amendment.
This is a classic legislative maneuver. The Senate leadership essentially scrapes out the inside of an existing bill and fills the empty shell with entirely new text to bypass the standard committee process.
In this case, they filled it with the SAVE Act.
Let's examine the SAVE Act, because it is the primary policy objective holding up the funding resolution. The Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act requires individuals to provide documentary proof of United States citizenship to register for federal elections.
The acceptable documents would primarily be a passport or a birth certificate, combined with photo identification.
Republicans view this as a necessary safeguard. Senator Kennedy argued that the influx of undocumented migrants over the past few years has severely damaged the public's confidence in the electoral system. He stated that elections fail if the public refuses to accept the results, and he positions the SAVE Act as the remedy for that distrust.
Democrats view the legislation as a calculated effort to suppress legitimate voters ahead of the 2026 midterms. Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois came to the floor with some practical math regarding the passport requirement.
The logistics are genuinely daunting.
Durbin noted that a new passport costs $165. Roughly half of the country currently holds one. With approximately 50 million Americans registering to vote or updating their registration each year, Durbin argued that the State Department would see its workload triple.
He equated the $165 fee to a modern poll tax, referencing the Supreme Court precedent that struck down a $1.50 poll tax in Virginia decades ago.
Democratic Senator Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico raised similar logistical concerns. He pointed out that the documentary requirements would disproportionately affect women who have changed their last names after marriage, and Native Americans who rely on tribal IDs or lack standard vital statistics records.
Lujan's floor time was incredibly heated. He noted that several Republican senators were absent from the chamber for fundraising events in California while the debate was happening. He challenged them to go to their local airports and explain the shutdown directly to the unpaid TSA agents.
Lujan actually asked the presiding officer about the rules for using profanity on the Senate floor before delivering his remarks. He dared Republicans to offer a unanimous consent request to pay the TSA workers, promising he would stay in the chamber to wait for it.
When Senator Thune spoke, he focused heavily on secondary amendments attached to the package. When he modified the Veterans Bill, he also introduced an amendment on behalf of Republican Senators Tommy Tuberville of Alabama and Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, specifically targeting protections for women and girls in athletics.
He added another provision prohibiting gender transition procedures for minors. Thune cited the Cass Review out of Great Britain and guidance from the American Society of Plastic Surgeons to argue there is insufficient scientific evidence supporting pediatric transition procedures. He challenged Democrats to defend the medical practices on the floor.
Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer dismissed the entire legislative package as an exercise in political messaging. He accused Republicans of trying to implement an algorithmic voter purge.
Schumer read into the record his concern that the SAVE Act would force states to submit their voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security. I have his quote here. They want Americans' information to be run through an algorithm that Elon Musk and DOGE could use to kick eligible American citizens off the voter rolls without them even knowing they were kicked off.
He added that Republicans want to make it harder to register to vote than it is to register to buy an AR-15.
Thune also filed perfecting amendments to adjust the exact enactment date of the SAVE Act, aiming for November 1st, 2026.
Right before the midterms, former President Trump has made the SAVE Act his primary legislative demand for this Congress. He told Republican members that passing it would guarantee electoral victories for the next 50 years.
So, you have a situation where the funding for federal emergency management and homeland security is entirely tangled up with debates over college athletics, pediatric medicine, and election administration.
The Senate attempted to invoke cloture on the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act. The vote failed, 47 to 37.
They needed 60.
Right. They fell 13 votes short, leaving the department operating without a budget, right as the administration is pushing to install new leadership.
The confirmation process is happening directly parallel to this funding crisis.
Let's look at the strange politics of the new DHS secretary.
And strange is exactly the right word for it. When you have a cabinet secretary nomination, especially Homeland Security, the party lines are highly predictable. But the committee vote for Markwayne Mullin to replace Kristi Noem as DHS secretary looked like someone scrambled the seating chart.
Let's set the table with the numbers. Senator Markwayne Mullin, Republican of Oklahoma, cleared the Homeland Security Committee on Thursday, March 19th. The final tally was 8 to 7, but the breakdown of those 8 yes votes is where the story actually lives.
Right, because the committee chairman, Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, voted against his own party's nominee.
Which is remarkably rare for a cabinet-level pick. If you look at the institutional history of the Senate, committee chairs are supposed to act as the floor managers for these nominations. They guide the nominee through the process, shield them from hostile questioning, and deliver the votes.
That is essentially a shepherding role.
Yes. But instead, Paul used his position as chair to actively prosecute the nominee, and he wasn't hiding his reasons. This stemmed directly from their confirmation hearing on Wednesday.
The two of them have a very public, very personal feud. During the hearing, Paul confronted Mullin over past disparaging comments Mullin had allegedly made about him in the press.
Paul specifically questioned Mullin's temperament. He asked the room whether senators could trust a man with, quoting Paul here, that kind of anger to run an agency as large and heavily armed as the Department of Homeland Security.
So, Paul votes no. In an ordinary committee scenario, with a narrow majority, losing the chairman sinks the nomination entirely. The math simply fails.
Unless a Democrat crosses the aisle.
Exactly. Senator John Fetterman, Democrat of Pennsylvania, steps in and votes yes to advance Mullin's nomination out of committee.
I want to pause on that for a second. We talk frequently about party discipline, but Fetterman effectively rescuing a Republican DHS nominee over the objections of a Republican committee chair is a highly unusual sequence of events.
Fetterman has been carving out an independent streak on certain security and border issues for a while now. He has shown a willingness to break from his caucus when he feels like it. But stepping in to save Mullen's nomination when the rest of the Democrats were unified against him caught a lot of observers off guard.
Democrats anchored their opposition in questions about Mullen's executive experience and his approach to the ongoing DHS shutdown. They expressed concern that his confirmation might complicate the negotiations.
Which brings us to the floor action. Clearing committee on an 8-7 vote with cross-party defection is messy, but it gets the job done. Now Republican leadership has to get him confirmed by the full Senate.
Right. Which is why Senate Minority Whip John Thune, Republican of South Dakota, moved immediately to force the issue. He essentially bypassed any lingering committee-level drama by filing a cloture motion to cap debate and push toward a final vote. Here is how that reads in the Congressional Record. Quote, "We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule XXI-2 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 696, Markwayne Mullen, of Oklahoma, to be Secretary of Homeland Security."
That motion was backed by Thune and 18 other Republican senators.
Filing cloture is a standard procedural mechanism, but right now it serves as a massive flex of party discipline. The Republican leadership is clearly communicating that they have the votes on the floor, and they will not let a personal dispute derail their timeline.
They only need a simple majority on the floor. With the cloture motion filed, they are locking in a final vote, likely early next week.
The timing of this is critical because of what Mullen will inherit the second he takes the oath of office.
The shutdown.
Yes, the Department of Homeland Security has been operating without a budget for 2 months. The agency remains completely paralyzed by disagreements over immigration enforcement reforms.
We should think about what that actually looks like for a new cabinet secretary. Most new agency heads get a honeymoon period. They get a few weeks to review briefings, tour the facilities, and set a broad agenda.
Mullen won't get that. He is walking into a building where the funding has run dry and the personnel are stretched to the breaking point. The administration wants new leadership installed immediately to help broker an end to this stalemate.
That context explains why Republican leadership is moving so aggressively with the cloture filing. They cannot afford a protracted, month-long debate over Mullen's temperament when the department itself is out of money and the current secretary, Kristi Noem, is leaving at the end of the month.
Exactly. And the core issue keeping DHS shut down is the deep partisan divide over border security and interior enforcement.
Which is a perfect pivot point, because while the confirmation battle is playing out at the leadership level, the actual policy fight is happening simultaneously on the floor.
If you want to understand why DHS is frozen, you have to look at the specific immigration policies being debated right now, particularly the push to target ICE operations from the Senate floor.
And right now, the Senate floor is papered with amendments that would fundamentally rewrite what border enforcement agents are legally allowed to do.
Take Senate Amendment 4710 from Senator Andy Kim, a Democrat from New Jersey. He is proposing a hard freeze on the border enforcement workforce.
It specifically targets the money pipeline.
Right. Let me read the exact mechanism from the record. It says that appropriated funds, quote, may not be expended to pay the salaries of agents or officers of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or U.S. Customs and Border Protection, who were hired on or after the date of the enactment of this act.
Which means, if an agent retires tomorrow, the agency cannot legally use current funds to hire their replacement. The amendment also bans using that money for recruitment ads or sign-on bonuses.
You have to look at the budget history to see why this is landing on the floor now. ICE's budget has grown from roughly $3.4 billion in 2004 to over $9.2 billion in 2024. Then, they received massive infusions recently, including a $75 billion package in July 2025 and another $10 billion stopgap this past March.
The argument from Kim and his allies is that handing over billions for expansion without new accountability measures is a non-starter. They look at the recent failure of a major funding package on Thursday and the 47-37 procedural vote on Friday that halted DHS operations, and they see leverage. They are using these amendments to pull the emergency brake on headcount.
Then you have Democratic Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware. She submitted two separate proposals that shift the debate away from staffing levels and directly into domestic civil liberties.
The first one, Amendment 4717, establishes a physical boundary around the voting process. It bans DHS personnel from conducting civil immigration enforcement within 100 feet of polling places, early voting sites, or voter registration locations.
The text explicitly prohibits agents from questioning individuals about their citizenship status or conducting surveillance on people entering or exiting those buildings.
There are carved-out exceptions for executing criminal warrants based on probable cause, or if an agent is responding to an imminent threat of serious bodily harm. But routine civil enforcement checks outside a voting booth would be off the table.
Let me read how she defines the restriction for the department. Quote, "The Secretary of Homeland Security shall not and shall ensure that an officer, employee, or agent of the Department of Homeland Security does not, at a covered location, conduct any civil immigration enforcement action."
That directly addresses a very specific fear among voting rights advocates. They have argued that parking a marked CBP or ICE vehicle near a polling location in an immigrant-heavy neighborhood depresses voter turnout, even if the agents never step out of the car.
The amendment also requires the DHS Secretary to report any alleged violations to Congress and the Inspector General within 30 days. It builds a compliance paper trail into the statute.
Her second proposal, Amendment 4720, moves from physical boundaries to digital ones. She wants to ban DHS from compiling surveillance databases on U.S. citizens.
This is where you see lawmakers trying to catch up with the private data market. The wording is designed to close loopholes that agencies use to bypass direct surveillance restrictions.
She includes both ICE and CBP in this restriction.
Yes. The amendment states DHS, quote, "may not conduct any surveillance on United States citizens to create, assemble, maintain, purchase, license, subscribe to, access, or otherwise obtain information for the purpose of compiling, enriching, or aggregating a database that identifies United States citizens."
The verbs purchase and subscribe to are the operational keys there.
Let's unpack that. Why are those specific words so relevant?
Because federal law enforcement often avoids direct surveillance entirely. If the government lacks the warrant required to track your phone's location, they can sometimes just open a checkbook and buy that exact same location history from a commercial data broker.
DHS has been actively expanding its analytics capabilities. They recently directed $2 million toward an analytics and data research facility. They are also working on rolling out body cameras for ICE agents by February 2025, which generates massive amounts of footage.
Which all flows into the same ecosystem. If you are aggregating video, third-party data broker purchases, and agency arrest records, you are building an incredibly detailed surveillance network. This amendment attempts to put strict guardrails around that capability when it comes to U.S. citizens.
When you stack these three proposals together, a hiring freeze, a ban on polling place enforcement, and a wall against digital data purchasing, you see the full scope of the minority party's strategy here.
They are leveraging the must-pass nature of the DHS funding bills to force a broader conversation on the operational limits of federal law enforcement.
And while that debate keeps DHS funding tied up in knots, a completely separate oversight battle is breaking open regarding government data security. Which brings us to the DOGE data breach probe. Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, filed 2 amendments on March 20, 2026, aimed directly at the cryptocurrency sector. And he is approaching the issue from 2 completely different altitudes.
He is looking at the street corner and the Federal Reserve at the same time. Let's start at the street corner.
Right. The First Amendment targets virtual currency kiosks. Most people know them as Bitcoin ATMs. They are the standalone machines you see popping up in gas stations, laundromats, and convenience stores.
They look just like traditional cash ATMs. You feed in physical bills, and the machine deposits cryptocurrency into a digital wallet. The issue is, who exactly is using them, and why?
Durbin's filing highlights a specific vulnerability. These kiosks have become a primary mechanism for wire fraud and romance scams. A bad actor convinces someone, often an elderly person, that their bank account is frozen, or that a family member is in jail.
They tell the victim to withdraw cash, drive to the nearest gas station, and feed it into one of these machines to clear the fictitious debt. And because of how blockchain technology works, once that crypto hits the scammer's wallet, the transaction is immutable. There is no central bank to call to reverse the charge.
To combat that, Durbin's amendment introduces rigorous operational requirements. If you are a new customer trying to send $300 or more, the operator cannot just process it. They have to get you on a live telephone or video call first.
A literal human employee has to talk to you. They have to confirm you understand the transaction and try to assess if you are being coerced.
The legislation also mandates a 48-hour transaction freeze for all new users during their first 2 weeks on the platform. It creates a mandatory cooling-off period. If the victim realizes they've been scammed the next morning, the money hasn't permanently moved yet.
That fundamentally changes the business model for these kiosk operators. The entire appeal of these machines is instant, anonymous transactions with very little overhead. Forcing a company to run a live call center and hold funds for 2 days introduces massive administrative hurdles.
And the financial penalties for failing to protect consumers are severe. Here is how the amendment handles refunds for fraud victims. Any person who knowingly denies a refund to a customer who is entitled to a refund shall be liable to the customer for 3 times the amount of the refund owed, or $10,000, whichever is greater.
$10,000 for a single violation. If a scammer talks a victim into sending $500, the operator could be on the hook for $10,000 if they refuse a valid refund claim.
They also face a $10,000 daily penalty for failing to register the physical address of every single kiosk with the Treasury Department.
So that is the street-level intervention. What is the Second Amendment?
The second proposal zooms out to the macroeconomy. Durbin wants a statutory no-bailout policy for the entire decentralized finance sector.
This is fascinating. As digital assets become more intertwined with traditional banking, lawmakers are clearly thinking about systemic risk. They are looking at the sheer volatility of these markets and imagining worst-case scenarios.
Exactly. The amendment explicitly prohibits federal agencies from rescuing failing digital asset firms. I'll read from the text. A federal agency may not provide financial assistance to a digital asset intermediary to prevent the failure or bankruptcy of the digital asset commodity intermediary.
It cuts off the escape routes. We all remember 2008, when the government stepped in with massive rescue packages because certain financial institutions were deemed too deeply embedded in the economy to let them fail.
Durbin is trying to build a firewall before we reach that point with crypto. The legislation specifically bars these companies from accessing emergency liquidity facilities under Section 13(3) of the Federal Reserve Act.
It also explicitly blocks the Treasury Secretary from tapping the Exchange Stabilization Fund to prop up a failing crypto exchange. He is sending a very clear message. If you take massive risks in a volatile, unregulated space, taxpayers will not be your safety net.
He submitted both of these provisions as amendments to a Veterans Advisory Committee bill, which shows the urgency here. Lawmakers are searching for any active legislation to attach these structural limits to.
The contrast in Washington right now is striking. You have an administration that has openly encouraged digital asset expansion, pushing to allow crypto in retirement accounts. On the other side, you have lawmakers like Durbin trying to sever the industry from federal support entirely.
We will see if either amendment secures a floor vote. Up next, the congressional pushback on presidential pardons.
Senator Peter Welch, a Democrat from Vermont, is testing a new strategy to force a public debate on executive clemency.
He submitted 3 distinct amendments this week. All of them are attached to Senate Bill 1383, which deals with establishing a Veterans Advisory Committee on Equal Access. 2 of these amendments are straightforward condemnations. The third is a massive $2 billion financial proposal.
Attaching measures about presidential pardons to a Veterans Committee bill highlights the reality of the current legislative calendar. There are very few bills moving through the chamber right now, so members are grabbing onto whatever vehicle they can find to get their priorities on the record.
The first condemnation amendment targets the commutation of former Congressman George Santos. Santos pleaded guilty to wire fraud and aggravated identity theft.
He admitted to a long list of offenses. He embezzled funds from his own campaign donors. He charged credit cards without authorization. He even obtained unemployment benefits through fraud and filed false reports to the House of Representatives.
The judge originally sentenced him to 87 months in prison. Then, on October 17, 2025, President Donald Trump commuted that sentence. Santos had served less than 3 months of a 7-year term.
The administration argued that Santos had been mistreated in custody and placed in solitary confinement. They characterized him as a road figure whose punishment did not fit the crime.
Welch's amendment lays out the exact crime Santos committed, the length of his original sentence, and the financial penalties he faced. Then it delivers a single declarative sentence. Reading from the record, Congress condemns the commutation of the sentence of George Anthony DeVolder Santos.
A commutation is an absolute constitutional power of the executive branch. Congress has no authority to reverse it. What Welch is doing here is forcing his colleagues into a corner. If this amendment gets a vote, every senator has to decide whether to officially co-sign the commutation by voting against the measure, or publicly rebuke the president's decision by supporting it.
The second condemnation amendment takes that exact same procedural tactic and applies it to a case with massive foreign policy implications.
It addresses the full pardon of former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez.
The scale of criminal conduct in this case is completely different. Hernandez was convicted in a United States federal court of conspiring to import over 400 tons of cocaine into the country. He received a 45-year prison sentence.
The findings in Welch's amendment read exactly like an international trafficking indictment. They state that Hernandez accepted millions in bribes from cartels, including a $1 million payment directly from El Chapo. The text notes the 400 tons of cocaine he facilitated is enough for approximately 4.5 billion individual doses.
The amendment also details how Hernandez used the institutions of the Honduran state to run this operation. He allegedly deployed heavily armed Honduran National Police officers equipped with machine guns and grenade launchers to protect cocaine shipments as they moved toward the U.S. border. And he promised smugglers who paid him off that he would shield them from extradition to the United States.
During his trial, Hernandez claimed he was the victim of political persecution, but his appeals were unsuccessful. The amendment text includes a striking quote attributed to him regarding his operations. He reportedly boasted to his co-conspirators, "We are going to stuff the drugs up the gringos' noses, and they're never even going to know it."
Hearing that read into the Congressional Record really puts the pardon into perspective. President Trump granted Hernandez a full and complete pardon on December 1, 2025. He was released after serving less than 4 years.
The amendment addresses the fallout of that decision directly. I will read exactly how it is framed in the text. President Donald J. Trump's pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez is an affront to the federal law enforcement and judicial officials who investigated and prosecuted him, and to the jurors who performed their civil duty in convicting him.
the diplomatic consequences are already playing out. Honduran authorities immediately reactivated their own fraud and money laundering charges against him and are seeking an international warrant. Welch is arguing that releasing a convicted cartel affiliate severely damages the credibility of the United States when we ask other nations to cooperate on anti-narcotics efforts.
That brings us to the third amendment in this package. This one moves past formal condemnation and attempts to address the financial reality of clemency. When Santos was sentenced, the court ordered him to pay over $373,000 in restitution.
When an offender receives a pardon or a commutation, the mechanism to force them to pay their victims often disappears. The court orders are effectively neutralized. That leaves the people who were defrauded entirely out of luck.
To solve that, Welch proposed Senate Amendment 4730. It sets up a federal mechanism to pay those victims. And it funds that mechanism by transferring $2 billion out of the unobligated balances from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which passed in July 2025.
$2 billion is an enormous pool of capital to suddenly redirect toward victim compensation. It shows how seriously lawmakers are taking the collateral damage of these executive actions.
Here is the exact directive from the amendment. Of the unobligated balances of amounts appropriated, $2 billion shall be transferred to the Attorney General and shall be available to the Attorney General to provide restitution payments to victims who will not receive restitution from an offender because of a pardon or commutation issued on or after January 20th, 2025.
The date there is doing a lot of work. By specifying January 20th, 2025, Welch is squarely targeting the current administration's clemency actions. He is effectively saying that if the executive branch decides to clear an offender, the federal government should shoulder the financial burden of making the victims whole.
All three of these amendments have been formally filed and placed in the pending queue. They are waiting for the Senate to determine the next procedural steps. None of them are scheduled for an immediate floor vote.
It highlights the growing constitutional tension between the expansive pardon power of the executive branch and Congress's role in oversight. The legislative branch cannot stop a pardon, but they are clearly looking for new ways to exact a political and financial cost for them.
We will keep an eye on the docket to see if leadership brings any of these measures to the floor. That wraps up our coverage for this week.
Thanks for listening. We will see you next time.
And finally, before we go, a rare moment of unity in a deeply divided chamber.
I always love a rare moment of unity. What are we agreeing on today? Renaming a post office in Ohio?
Even better. Senator Dick Durbin introduced a measure today to federally regulate frequent flyer programs. It would completely ban point expirations and require a full year's notice before airlines can devalue your miles.
Oh, that is the ultimate bipartisan issue. Nothing unites lawmakers across the aisle quite like the shared trauma of trying to book a holiday flight with abruptly devalued sky miles.
Exactly. It just proves that even if Congress is deadlocked on funding the government, they might at least try to save your summer vacation.
Hey, if the federal government actually shuts down, we are definitely going to need those points to get out of town. I might call my representative about this one.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Keep an eye on the whip count, and we will catch you next time the gavel drops.